Today we're having a choice between what is politically expedient by those who have political power to serve special interest, or we're deciding what is a better way. Because the consequences of what this bill does is it's going to lead to layoffs. It's going to lead to reduced hours. It's going to lead to rising costs for our neighbors, our seniors, our disabled. And this isn't hypothetical. It isn't a fallacy or a myth. These are real people. And these are real problems. Because what I've heard today out of the majority party, a party that has absolute control of this floor of the House, control of the Senate, control of the governor, negotiating this bill amongst itself, has come out and said something that is true, and that is we have people in our society that make too little. That is true. But to refuse to acknowledge that there are alternatives, or refuse to acknowledge that there are consequences for what we choose to do here today, is very short-sighted, and it makes me wonder why the rush, why the narrow focus. This Senate bill requires us to balance people who are making minimum wage versus all these other consequences. And I suppose if you refuse to look over here at the consequences, if you just want to hope they're not there, then that leaves you with just this group, the group that are working that don't make enough. Now, we've heard Representative Bentz say repeatedly, there are ways to do this, the better way. Earned income tax credits. The plethora of jobs that have been introduced the last few years to try to raise incomes in Oregon. We passed a bill not that long ago saying we've got to put people on a retirement plan mandatory because they're not saving enough. And yet those same folks who advocated for that stand up and say people aren't earning enough. You know, maybe there's a correlation. We want to raise incomes in this state. But today is a debate that's really not disputed as to what the consequence of the bill does, but it's disputed as to what the consequence of the bill is. So I want to sum up a couple of those in the spirit of the previous speaker to point out what's been said. What Representative Fagan said in committee is that these consequences, like to business, were hypothetical, but the wages to people were real. And I think what you've heard here today is that's not hypothetical. Permission to use a visual aid, Madam Speaker.
Representative, try to use the monikers when you refer to your colleagues. Representative McLane.
Actually, that's not in the rule, Madam Speaker.
Well, consider it a nice ask. Representative McLane requests unanimous consent that the rule be suspended and he be allowed to use a visual aid. Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered.
We've seen this woman before when Representative Springer was talking. Is this fake? Is this woman hypothetical? Because she represents a whole lot of people. People who agonize every day over how they're going to pay the bills. She knows she's going to have to lay people off. And speaking of laying people off, we heard from Chris Gorsuch, our representative from East Multnomah County, mentioned that things like that might happen. We don't know. We've heard from Representative from Beaverton that studies show people won't get laid off. Yet we also have studies and independent verification, as Representative Ben said, they are. So here's a logical question I have, colleagues, as we vote on.
Actually, you can't yield. Representative Barker yields his time. That's right. No, actually, you can. I'm sorry, you did not speak on the main motion. Representative Widener yields his time. Thank you.
What the question becomes, and I guess we have to apply logic. Now, I know that we have statements from people like this woman who is struggling to pay the bills at a restaurant. I know that there are statements we've received, thousands of people across the state, NFIB talking about their folks, all the business organizations saying, hey, this is going to cause layoffs. When you raise incomes this high, we're going to have to make choices. Now, even ignoring the people that say that, I got to ask you this question. And it has to go to the question, maybe the carrier could even answer it in his closing. Do you really believe no one will be laid off? Seriously, do you believe no one will be laid off when the minimum wage goes up 30, 40%? Because I got to ask you, what about the worker who is laid off? Is that compassion? I mean, we've heard the important, in fact, the representative from East Portland, she said, after the passage of this bill, quote, no one has to live in poverty again, end quote. Well, what about the person that loses his or her job? What about her? Or maybe that's hypothetical. Unless you're prepared to say, no one will be laid off. We've seen, colleagues, that these consequences that we've been talking about here, Representative from Ashland said, hey, it's changing the status quo. Don't be afraid. There's always fear when there's changing a status quo, as if dismissing all these people as somehow being afraid of changing the status quo. Does that look like fear? Or does that look like agony over what she knows about to happen? The only fear I saw, Madam Speaker, was on this floor today on those who wouldn't allow a people the right to say. But one thing we know, that several things happened here today, several members admitted from the majority party, is yes, it's going to have an impact on jobs. Yes, some people will lose Medicaid, health care coverage. Yes, at first there's no cliff, but I guess there was a glide path, but the cliff's not as bad as you think. Besides, people shouldn't be on government benefits. We want them to work. Absolutely true, we want them to work. Absolutely true, there's dignity in work. Absolutely true that the best welfare program is a good job. Absolutely true. But what I heard those folks say is that these consequences were outweighed by the need to raise the rate because those folks deserved better salary. Well, I'm telling you, yes, you have the power. It looks like you are going to move this, and this bill will pass on a purely partisan basis. So the question becomes, have you accepted the consequences? We've heard today that Oregon has a roaring economy. That was another thing we heard on the floor. We've got one of the best economies, according to Bloomberg, at least in this one sector. We're an economy. How do you think this is going to land when a recession comes? Because let me tell you, the economy's not roaring east of those mountains. And you heard from Representative Bentz say clearly, the damage you're doing to my district is irreversible. But again, do you accept the consequences? Because that's what you're deciding today.
Carl has his hand up.
I know, I'm trying to make sure that he hasn't spoken already. Give me a second. Representative Barker yields his time. Please continue.
Two of the misstatements today. Myths, as we heard from the representative from the greater city of Gresham, land of liberty and justice for all. That's quite a moniker. But what we heard today was us reading that, hey, we're not going to raise prices, implying clearly that this won't raise prices. And then we heard it expressly from representative from Tigard in Southwest Portland who said, it's a myth that prices are going to raise. Well, let's talk about that. Is that a myth? Let's talk about what Senate Bill 1532 does. First, from the Oregon Healthcare Association. Without significant support from the state through increased Medicaid reimbursement in future biennia, low-income seniors could be denied access to long-term care services and supports. Let me quote from Coos County. Quote, over 30% of our population, Curry County, over 30% of our population is over 65, and Curry County has the highest number of veterans per capita than any other county in the state. Many of these residents on low fixed incomes and are currently struggling. The inflationary costs with this legislative increase could negatively impact our seniors, veterans, and others on fixed incomes, and they will not be receiving any increases on this nature, thus devaluing their dollar in the economy. So I guess here's the second question. Do you really believe price inflation won't occur? Or are you prepared to accept the consequences of that? So I guess that's a juxtaposition, Madam Speaker. Yes, we've heard the stories. We've experienced the stories. You forget, my colleagues, that the poorest area of the state is on this side of the room, not that. You forget that Portland has some of the highest income. Happy Valley has the highest income in the state. So when you describe the impact on the poor, perhaps you should ask about the rural poor. The lowest income in the state amongst any town is Prineville. I represent Prineville. So while you describe the impact on the poor, we experience it at home. So when we stand before you and say, have you considered these consequences? They're not hypotheticals. They're called constituents. And so we got to look you in the eye and we got to ask, do you really believe no one will lose a job? Do you really believe prices are not going up? The impact on kids. I have a 21-year-old, 18 and 16-year-old. They all work. I'm glad that they grew up in a time when they were able to enter the marketplace. I got to ask you this question. Do you believe that kids will have the same opportunity that they have today when the minimum wage is at $15 in the Portland area, $13.50 in other areas, $12.50 in our areas? Do you really believe that kids are going to have the same equal opportunity? Because I got to tell you, for all those kids out there right now, eagerly listening to this debate? If you find it hard to get a job, remember this day. And remember what happened. We also talked about, colleagues, the impact on our schools currently. I know the budget gaming that went on here. Representative Smith talked a lot of food and shelter. God bless him. He talked great length about it. Most people were falling asleep. Anytime Representative Buckley and Smith begin a discussion, most people hit the exits.
Representative Wilson, you did not speak before, so you may yield your time. Thank you very much. Please begin. Please continue.
Having been locked in one of those rooms in my service in Ways and Means, I can tell you, it's riveting for the first 15, 20 seconds, and after a while your eyes glaze over. But these guys know the budgets. They don't agree necessarily why it isn't in Ways and Means. I understand it. But let's face it, this is going to have an impact on the budget. And that's why I'm asking you another consequence. Remember the balance? Do we want to see people earn money? Yes. But this bill has consequences, and the question is, are you prepared for those consequences? And of course, one of them is the budget. Are you prepared for the increased costs in school budgets, county budgets, city budgets? They're coming, unless you're prepared to say there are no consequences. Then, if you can't, you've made a decision today. And you accept those consequences. We have impacts today on mothers, on programs for prenatal health, Representative Hayden talked about. Finally, permission to use a different visual aid, Madam Speaker.
I will keep on going.
Thank you. We have this. Colleagues, the balance that is occurring today in this vote in this chamber has consequences. And if you are preparing to accept those consequences, impacts on military retirees, the men and women who have served in our armed forces, who have retired, and now on a fixed income. Seniors, the disabled, entry aids and the kids, the layoffs on people, the reduced hours, the impacts on care for the mothers on Medicaid, the rising costs of our government. Even if you accept all the consequences, I'm not voting for this bill today because of a process. A process, a short session that was never meant for this, a process where this wasn't vetted in Ways and Means. But finally, I'm not voting myself a pay raise. Here's blown up the legal opinion. Now, the interesting thing is, Representative Williamson indicated that, well, you can get a different opinion with a different lawyer. And of course, what we found out is true. You can. So it was represented to us that Dexter Johnson said, well, no, it's not a pay raise. Well, not quite. You could be de facto declared to be volunteering. Speaker Kotek submitted, and Representative Evans talked about in committee, well, no, it's not. If you ask the question, it's a direct relationship. Then we have a plethora of lawyers who say, no, it is. We have this opinion that says it is. In fact, this statute talks about it. It would require an increase in members' annual salaries in 2022, and then it goes on and describes here. So I guess, colleagues, you have to wonder, why be this careless? We have fought the good fight. We have stood up for rural communities. We've stood up for the folks who over the next year will lose their job because of the increase in urban areas, because of automation, and who are replaced. But in the end, Madam Speaker, one party is in charge. This bill will pass with no Republican votes. And so I say to Oregonians, today they accepted the consequences of their decision. And the question is, will you make them realize it? Thank you, Madam Speaker.